Hello, I'm Casey Richardson here for Castanet's Meet Your Candidate Q&A with South Okanagan West Kootenay Green Party candidate Tara Howse. Tara, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Casey. Thanks for having me.
Starting off here, let's go with a basic question. Why should a voter choose you to represent this riding?
The biggest reason is because I actually can represent constituents. We have what's called a no-whipped voting policy. And so this is unique amongst the Green Party and amongst all federal parties. We're the only party that doesn't force their caucus and their members to vote the way the leader tells them to. So if there is something that I disagree with in our platform because it's in better needs of the constituents or it's what constituents want, I'm actually able to voice that opinion and bring that forward, whereas the other parties have to toe a party line and basically just be the party lapdogs.
All right. So what's the biggest issue locally that has not been correctly addressed by the federal government?
Locally, the big things I'm hearing about are housing, and this is something that's occurring across the nation. I'm sure you've heard of this. So housing is impacting everything from our vulnerable populations and homelessness issues all the way up to market housing and the economy. So we really have to start taking this as a national approach to this, declare it a crisis, and start working together to address this. The second thing I'm hearing, and it's going hand in hand, is climate action, particularly in relation to forest fires. There really hasn't been any action happening. It's all just political rhetoric and spin. So it's really time once again to bring a voice into Parliament that can actually stand up and start implementing actions like canceling Trans Mountain expansion.
And diving into the housing issue, which is a major issue for many people in this riding, like you've touched on affordability to buy, limited rental stock, what specific plans do you have to help the average person in the South Okanagan West Kootenay achieve housing stability?
Well, there's two things that I really bring forward. One is, once again, as a federal MP, I really would love to advocate for an actual housing advocate to address this issue on a national level. However, at the local level, I'm really excited. I finished up some really in-depth housing research very recently for the regional district of Kootenay boundary. And so this included looking into the Okanagan, looking at best practices on how we can actually address rural housing needs, because what's going to work here, in the riding, whether we're talking about Slocan City or Penticton, it's going to look very different than what it will look for in Vancouver or Ottawa or Toronto. So we need this locally based approach, and this includes everything from addressing the increased service costs. We have a lot of unserviced land in this area, so things like septic. Some communities aren't even on a septic system, some communities are on a septic system, so they may need sewer or water infrastructure upgrades. To recognizing that we don't typically have that large developer that you may see in the Vancouvers or Kelownas. We have builders that are acting as developers. So we have to develop a new financing system to actually allow them to carry the risk to do housing developments, because they may be able to carry a one-off house, but to do even a 10-unit housing development is really, really difficult for a lot of our small builders. These are just a couple of the small local ideas I'd love to implement, but of course there's the federal issues of things like allowing the CMHC to go back to its mandate and supporting things like cooperative housing and allow tiny house mortgages. So a lot to talk about, and I could talk your ear off for hours on housing.
Diving into another question here, as the COVID-19 pandemic continues, what in your opinion needs to happen in order to get it under control? And do you support vaccine passports?
So I'm just going to touch on the second piece there. Vaccine passports right now is a provincial issue. And so it's a provincial health order, and it is actually not something the federal government can really get into. But what I'm hearing from people on their passports is just this, particularly with local organizations and businesses are concerned about the administration involved in it. And I think it's a really great example of a top-down approach without looking at the individual and smaller community needs. So where I would like to shift the strategy, whether we're talking about vaccine rates overall or the vaccine passports, is community-based health supports. So we have to start looking at our communities, start supporting our local organizations, get away from the institutional mandates that are happening. We have whole populations that have been historically oppressed or just completely treated horribly. Indigenous people or queer communities been treated horribly within the health system. And so we have to start looking again at how we can encourage vaccine uptake while at the same time respecting people and again, looking at a community-based approach that differs from this top-down hierarchical structure.
Okay, so for yourself, vaccine passports at this point, do you think it's the right measure going through BC, or what's your opinion in there?
I think it's again a poor, it's a half decent policy implemented very poorly. They didn't take the time to stop and chat with people. We didn't look forward. There was no forward thinking when this was all starting to roll out. So I would like to see a bit of a consideration again about bringing things back and talking to our small businesses, talking to our organizations. I spoke with some library staff. The libraries are wondering how they're going to enforce this, because that's what's happening is we're going to be asking our nonprofit organizations to enforce passports on people who may need to use the service and may not be able to. So again, I'd like to just kind of slow things down and talk to our local communities about the best way to move forward in tandem with increasing overall vaccination rates.
Mm-hmm. And moving forward in this pandemic, that's really the key goal from your opinion here, is encouraging those vaccination rates and encouraging communication between all levels of business for what they want to see.
Business, governments, organizations. Like I said, there's more than just the federal government or the provincial government. We've got local governments, municipalities, regional districts. We've got First Nations governments to consider. So these are just all things we need to have these greater conversations, and while at the same time also talk about encouraging protocols. Still, we still have to wear masks, ensuring social distancing or physical distancing, and washing our hands. These are really good infectious disease protocols that we should just be mindful of and keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And this summer in the interior has been gravely impacted by wildfires and an unprecedented heat wave. What should be done to better protect the area and its residents? And where does climate change action land on your list of priorities?
Obviously, as the Green Party, we're very strong with climate action. There hasn't been any, and it's, as a Green Party member, it's been frustrating seeing the lack of action in government. And you see this with the three big political parties, Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP. I go back to the whipped voting, where they're just not able to bring forward these ideas. When we talk about in the interior, forest fires are absolutely intimately tied with forestry mismanagement practices. And so Green Party MP Paul Manley, he brought forward a motion to halt old growth logging. This shouldn't be a big question. This should be easily supported, and if there's miswording in it, then another member should be able to come forward and reword and support this. But that's not happening. We're not having that cross-party collaboration, and that's where the Greens excel. We are able to bring forward ideas, work across party lines, and you see this again in Green MP track records with co-sponsoring bills. They are constantly co-sponsoring bills and seconding motions in order to move forward good legislation. So if we want to talk about climate, we have to start talking about cross-party collaboration, and we have to bring forward a national caucus that is an arm's length from the government and has representatives from the science community, youth, and Indigenous leaders, in order to really bring forward policy ideas that can once again be implemented because our MPs are able to work on them locally and work on them together. And so in the interior, again, forestry is a big issue. And so we have to halt old growth. We have to stop this, and we have to review how we are managing our forests. And this involves international trade agreements. It also involves local economies. But we have to start taking a stand and saying these things. And then as far as the heat dome goes, this is hand in hand with climate change, and it's devastating. I think it was 600 deaths occurred during the heat dome. I may be a little off on that number. And this is just not acceptable, and it's happening amongst our vulnerable populations. And we have to realize the impacts on different populations of how climate's going to be impacting us locally and globally. It is our Indigenous populations that are going to be typically in poverty. It's our senior populations that don't have air conditioning in their long-term care homes. These are the people that are at greatest risk right now, and we have to start taking care of them.
Mm-hmm. And how do you plan to work with Indigenous communities in the area and address their needs and concerns?
Specifically for Truth and Reconciliation, or just in general?
Just in general.
Right. So in regards to Truth and Reconciliation, just because I did bring it up there, and the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, reconciliation has always been a huge core for me. And it's something that we all have to recognize is an internal process. And so we can have federal government mandates, which are needed right now, and I will touch on that. But as individuals, we also have to take the independent responsibility to understand what colonization has done to people in this country. I'm really proud that the Green Party was the first federal party to support and endorse all calls from both the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Truth and Reconciliation. And it was a big reason for me joining that party as well. And when we look at local initiatives, again, it's working with the organizations that are here, like the center with COINS, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the acronym there, with COINS and with our First Nations bands in this region. There's a number of overlapping and unceded territories in this area, and we have to work locally to address how they see reconciliation moving forward. And so it's going to look different for every organization and for every nation, for our Métis communities as well. At the federal level, once again, we just have to recognize that there have been atrocities committed, health atrocities, social atrocities, economic atrocities, and we're still feeling those impacts. Obviously, the unmarked graves has raised this to a greater awareness to the general public. I'm really actually happy because I've been on the doorsteps and people are asking me this question, and I didn't get that in 2019. People didn't understand what reconciliation meant or why it was really important. So I'm really happy that I'm able to actually talk about it. And as a white settler, I feel like I have a greater responsibility, and I'm willing to take on that responsibility to help share and place that burden on myself instead of placing it on our Indigenous populations. We need leaders to help share the information, and that shouldn't be taken upon as a First Nations or an Indigenous person. That burden of responsibility shouldn't be on them.
And is there anything else you would like voters to know about you?
Just the general, I'm really excited to be here. I really am. I've really enjoyed this process. I do firmly believe in democracy, and I firmly believe in choice. And so we have to really start considering, where is our vote going and how is your voice being counted? Because I can be your voice and I can do that. And we need these strong voices in Parliament that can work across party lines. And so really consider, has your voting strategy been working for you? And if not, it's time for change. It's time for the Green Party. It's time for myself as a Green MP to bring forward your concern and your voice.
All right, great. Thank you, Tara, for joining me and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Casey.